It's almost like every day we're focused on what is wrong. But maybe a better question is what is right with people?
Dr. Chan Hellman,
the world expert on the science of hope.
We believe that hope is a feeling, but because hope is a way of thinking, we know it's something that we can teach and nurture.
The guy who's changing the way we think about resilience.
Hope is a mindset, and hope is a science that can be measured. What happens when we nurture hope in relationships? We see significant gains in relationship satisfaction.
Hope in and of itself, does that lower the likelihood of a breakup or divorce? If I am an athlete and my hope level increases, what happens?
We see significant gains in performance. Pain tolerance was significantly higher. The association between hope and physical well-being is really profound. Diabetes, spinal cord injury. We see research suggesting improved cancer survival rates.
And at the same time, you have a story of hope in your own life.
During about the 8th grade, I was transitioning into homelessness. One day, I was in the gym. That 5 minutes is the reason I'm alive today.
What are the difference in results between optimism and hope?
Hope tends to outperform optimism as a stronger predictor of outcomes.
For people who are listening to this and just thinking, I'm feeling really hopeless right now, what strategies are available?
So I think the first thing is
welcome to Full Spectrum, where I bring you unfiltered stories and actionable strategies from innovators who have done wild things, all designed for you to apply in your own life. I'm Molly Kawahara, and this is my podcast. I'm so psyched to be here with you all. I'm Molly Kawahara, and this is my podcast, Full Spectrum. Welcome. Now, on this podcast, I have literally one goal, and it is to give you strategies and tools you can use in your own life. That's what I'm setting out to do. You can let me know if I accomplish this. And so the format of this podcast, at least as it currently stands, is there's an interview with a guest that you'll hear from. And then after, there'll be a section where I actually distill the insights we talked about into clear strategies you can use. And we're talking routines, frameworks, mindsets, daily practices, anything like that. And for a long time, I've been interested in cross-domain knowledge, which is like, what can entrepreneurs learn from athletes? And I really believe that whatever you do, whatever walk of life you're in, there are strategies and tools and knowledge that we could gain from people who do something totally different from us. So I think right now, a lot of people are interested in how to improve mental health. So we're going to talk to psychologists and researchers who have uncovered a lot of answers for us in different aspects of mental health. I think a lot of people are interested in how to advance change in whatever sector you're in. So we're going to talk to colleagues I worked with at the White House, people at the forefront of social change who have done it very effectively and can tell you how. You know, if you're interested in how to build stuff, how to scale things, we're going to talk to entrepreneurs who have really valuable lessons in when to change course, how to pivot, what it means to fail, and not only fail, what does it look like to move through that failure? So that's the idea here. And if we haven't met yet, I'm Molly. So I don't know, I grew up really struggling with my mental health, with my well-being, and later found out that was because I had been living with untreated bipolar 2 disorder, which explained everything. And then came along this guy talking about hope, and his name was Barack Obama. And I was really fascinated by that message, even though I couldn't personally relate to it. Like, I was not a hopeful person. I was very hopeless in life. And so I got involved with student organizing. And then years later, found myself somehow serving as a climate advisor at the White House under his administration, which was like a wild experience. And truly, I had no business being there. I was just lucky to serve with the most amazing, extraordinary people I've ever known who were kind enough to teach me everything I now know. And then years after I left the White House, I got a DM on Instagram from Patagonia. And ultimately, through a series of conversations, they asked to make a film about my life, which, to be honest, was like the weirdest ask I've ever gotten and very unexpected. But if you've ever had somebody who gives you huge insight into yourself that you don't realize, you know how that is? The director, Josh Bones Murphy, at one point he turned to me and he was like, you know, hope is the theme of your life, Molly. And I was like, Oh. And so Patagonia titled it The Scale of Hope. They were very adamant, hope needs to be in the title. And so hope really has become the theme of my life and work. And to be honest, like it always was, but I just didn't realize it. And we are dealing with a mental health crisis in the world, which I think could also be interpreted as a crisis of hope. And my theory of change has really become, if we can save ourselves, then we can save everything else. And then I discovered that hope is also a science. And it is rooted in decades of research within academia. And we're talking like peer-reviewed, published research studies that have uncovered a lot of stuff around hope that is very relevant to our lives. So today we're going to talk about the fact that hope is not a feeling, it's a mindset. And why is that relevant? Because mindsets can change. Hope is not something you actually have to passively wait for. It's a cognitive tool you can use to actively improve the circumstances around you. And that's why it's relevant. And whatever it is you're feeling today, if you're feeling frustrated, angry, concerned, uncertain, stressed, you are not alone in that. Like I am feeling those things with you. And they're really valid reasons to feel that way. With the state of society, with what's happening right now, where so many people feel like a loss of control, if you're feeling really low in hope, that is valid. And we're never going to tell you to feel hope. And also, hope isn't even a feeling, right? We're going to tell you you can use it because it works. Now, something to know, hope has been shown to be a better predictor of success than raw talent. It's also been shown to be a better predictor of success than things like positivity or optimism. Hope has been shown to impact everything from our physical health, we're talking cancer, diabetes, to our mental health. It's relevant to parenting, education. If you do any sports, if you're an athlete, very relevant to that. It's relevant to workplaces and burnout. I think this is some of those valuable information you've never heard of. And that's why my life's work has become trying to get it out there to everybody. So as a speaker today, these keynotes and workshops I do everywhere in the world, it's on imparting skills around hope and specifically evidence-based strategies rooted in its science. And how do we know this stuff? We know it because of researchers like Dr. Chan Hellman, who's our guest today. Chan is the world expert on the science of hope. He is the director of the Hope Research Center, professor at the University of Oklahoma. He has an amazing book, Hope Rising, and an incredible TED Talk. You'll learn a really powerful tool for diagnosing problems. Like I have seen this change the direction companies are going in when they use this framework. How hope helps us navigate challenges and the connections between hope and stress management. And Chan also has this extraordinary story in his own life about how he arrived at being a hope researcher, right? How does somebody do that? There's a story there. Now, also, this is part one of the interview because we found this interview to be so powerful, we didn't want to cut it short. So it's broken up into 2 episodes. So thank you for being here. I'm going to start by introducing Chan's story. Chan grew up in a small farming community in northwest Oklahoma. He describes this time when his family was one of the poorest in town, often without basic utilities like electricity or water. By the time he was in 7th grade, Chan described his family life as unraveling. His parents divorced, and his father had moved away. Chan describes that the pressure on his mother became too much, until eventually she stopped coming home.
During about the 8th grade time frame in my life, I was transitioning into homelessness. And for me, that was a choice, a decision that I made because for me, it was safer in that context. And it was also a really, really dark and hard time just trying to figure out the whole experience of survival, of being newly unhoused. I was also really focused on just making sure that nobody else knew. And so really trying to keep my situation hidden. And over time, it was obviously taking a real toll on my mental health, my well-being. And one day during the school day, I was in the gym and I was just up in the bleachers, and a teacher, a basketball coach, came up and sat down beside me. He knew something wasn't right. He didn't know obviously what was happening, but he came up and he just sat with me for several minutes, and he just was leaning in really close. His shoulder was touching, and he was just there with me. And finally, as he started to leave, he leaned over and he said, "Chan, you're going to be okay." And for me, that was such a transformational moment in my life, because what he didn't know and what nobody else knew was I actually had set a date and, a time and a plan and a strategy for me to escape the pain that I was experiencing. And as that time and space came, I was sitting there and really just that moment, he just came back in my mind, and I just heard him say again, "You're going to be okay." I really attribute that's one of the major reasons why I'm still alive today.
Thank you so much for sharing that. What a remarkable impact he had on you. How has that moment impacted you and shaped the work you now do today?
Such an important thing with the science of hope, and really so many of my personal experiences during my childhood and adolescence and early adulthood has really shaped my research. So many of the experiences that I've had, I'm fortunate enough to work in a place that allows me to conduct research on how trauma and adversity can rob us of hope. But most importantly, it also allows me to do research and to better understand what are the really simple strategies that can nurture and restore hope. And that's really the driving focus. And so that moment in time really helped me understand that hope is very much a social gift.
If we can step back for a second, how do we define hope?
Yeah, so I use Shane Lopez's really simple definition. Hope is the belief that the future will be better than today, and that I have a role to play in pursuing that future. Now, the reason I like that definition is because if I look at the first half of that, hope is the belief that the future will be better than today. That's really optimism. I expect things to just work out in some way. But hope goes beyond that by the idea that I have a role to play. And so in this way, hope is about taking action to pursue that future that we desire.
That's what separates hope from just wishful thinking and optimism. Optimism is more passive, like thinking things will turn out okay. But hope goes much deeper. It's believing you have the power to take action and influence the outcome.
So I'm curious, between optimism, which is hoping things work out, but I don't really play a role in whether they do, and hope, what are the difference in results?
Sure. So basically, what I want to make sure that I say is that optimism does have a significant contribution to well-being. But it turns out that in the empirical research, hope tends to outperform optimism as a stronger predictor of those outcomes. And Rick Snyder, who's the founder of hope theory, the way we're talking about it, is really based upon these three important yet very simple concepts: goals, pathways, and I use the word willpower, but the correct term is agency. Hope is really important because goals are in fact the cornerstone of our capacity for hope. So from the moment you wake up until the moment you go to bed, each and every one of us are pursuing goals in our life, whether in the short term or long term. The question with hope is whether or not we have the ability or the access to the pathways or the strategies to pursue and attain those goals. The final component, willpower, as we've already talked about, is this idea of being able to summon the mental energy and to sustain that energy and focus on those pathway pursuits.
Hope is made up of three core components: goals, agency, which Chan sometimes refers to as willpower, and pathways. Goals are the target we set for ourselves. Agency is our belief in our ability to achieve those goals. And pathways are the plans and strategies we create to get there. Goals, agency, pathways. I refer to it in my talks as GAP. That is your formula for spreading hope.
What's really important is to recognize that we have to have both that energy, that ability to focus our intention, and the pathways to achieve that. So, You might imagine that somebody has a lot of desire for some particular outcome, but if they don't know how to get there from here, we actually consider that to be lower hope.
I think a lot of people listening to this might be thinking, I'm a low hope person. And whether or not they actually are, like I worked with one leader who was like, I am so skeptical of hope. I'm just not that guy that's like, today's going to be a great day. And he scored one of the highest hope levels in the room. Because again, it's like that goals, willpower pathways. But for people who are listening to this and just thinking, I'm feeling really hopeless right now, or I have somebody in my life who is probably very low in hope, what strategies are available for them to be able to support low hope people?
So I think the first thing is the time frame. What we know, what the research is very clear on is that we are much better at short-term specific goals. So as a really quick example, while I was in high school, again, experiencing homelessness, when a teacher came to me and said, Chan, you need to do better in the classroom if you want to go to college. Now, for me, in that particular moment, that had no meaning to me whatsoever, because I'm just trying to survive today, right? I'm just trying to figure out, where am I going to eat? Where am I going to sleep? How am I going to stay safe? And so what I learned in that, and what our research shows, is that when you and I are experiencing distress, which is the emotional reaction to a lower hope scenario, that breaking it down into short-term specific goals becomes a much better predictor of those outcomes. Equally, it may be that we have the pathways to get there from here. Like if I'm going to run a marathon, then I have to engage in a particular schedule of training and endurance building. But if my energy isn't sufficient to sustain engaging in that pathway, we would consider that to be lower hope as well. So you have to have both willpower and pathways. With that, we begin to potentially brainstorm or identify the different pathways or strategies that I can use to get there from here. So if my goal is to get healthy, one pathway is to exercise. Another pathway might be focus on my nutrition. There's probably a third, a fourth, or a fifth. There's multiple pathways to that strategy. And when I first stumbled onto this concept of hope in my work, this was a new way of thinking about hope than I was used to. So if we think about how we use the word hope in our everyday conversation, for instance, we might talk to each other and say, hey, Molly, I hope you're well. I hope you have a great day. I'm in Oklahoma, and, it's pretty common for us when the storm season is here for us to say things like, I hope there are no tornadoes today.
Why is hoping for no tornadoes not true hope? Because you have no control over the weather. You're missing the A of GAP, agency.
And so in this way, wishing is passive towards the future. Hope is about taking action to pursue the future. It's really important to understand that hope is a mindset or a way of thinking. And I think sometimes we believe that hope is a feeling that people have. And in fact, hope is a cognitive process. And the reason that that's so important is because if hope was a feeling, there are times when it is hard to manage and navigate. But because hope is a way of thinking, we know it's something that we can teach and nurture. So this is what I love about hope, is that it's about action. I have a role to play. So hope is scientifically based upon goal expectancy theory, which is a motivational theory that explains human behavior.
The research on hope, it's wild. Chan indulges me in some rapid fire questions about how hope shows up in all areas of our lives. Let's start with a really interesting one. Athletes.
If I am an athlete and my hope level increases, what happens?
Research around athletic performance shows that when we intentionally nurture hope, we see significant gains in performance, significant improvements in well-being. There's also some pretty robust improvements in the ability to self-regulate during those high-intensity times, to remain clearly focused on the pathways to success or performance.
Okay, so what about the role of hope in relationships?
What happens when we nurture hope in relationships, we see significant gains in relationship satisfaction, certainly longevity in those relationships, but it really assumes that the goals and the pathways of hope are shared. So one of the things that I've been interested in is hope congruence. So looking at when my goals and pathways are congruent with my partners, that is, what is my hope level in the relationship? And what is their hope level in the relationship? And when those are congruent and positive, these real positive outcomes will follow.
So hope in and of itself, does that lower the likelihood of a breakup or divorce?
Sure. So as long as the hope levels for the partnership, for the couple, again, in that congruent space, we certainly see longevity in those relationships.
Okay, so what about work then? If you increase your hope levels in your job, does anything happen?
This is something that I'm very interested in now with the work we're doing with organizations and communities and systems within states. First and foremost, we see significant reductions in things like burnout. We see significant improvements in job satisfaction, in engagement, performance.
I think burnout is something so many people can relate to at work and beyond. So the idea that there is an association between increasing your hope level and decreasing your risk of burnout seems really relevant today.
Yeah, absolutely. What we find, what the research shows is that as I nurture my hope as an employee, or as a leader, help nurture the hope of my team, what I see is improvements in coping strategies with stress. As I look at burnout, one of the things that we pay attention to is that every job has demands. And every job also has resources like the meaningfulness of the work, a supportive team or a supportive leader, demands and resources. The idea is as long as those resources are sufficient to buffer the demands, then burnout is less likely to occur. The problem is in thinking about, the added stress and adversity of the pandemic and the economy and everything else that's going on, those resources may not be sufficient. And what we see is emotional exhaustion follows. And so in our work, what we pay attention to is that hope is an important internal resource that organizations can pay attention to buffer the demands of the work.
Okay, so if I boost my levels of hope at work, my job satisfaction goes up, my risk of burnout goes down, my teammates and I like each other more, I perform higher, and I can handle stress better. I would have given anything to know about this in my 20s. Okay, but what about our health? Can hope impact the way we physically feel?
If I have a disease, cancer is incredibly prevalent today. We all have a loved one who's experienced cancer. What happens if I increase my hope level?
Sure. So there's actually quite a bit of research in this area. The association between hope and physical well-being, especially in the context of cancer, diabetes, spinal cord injury, is really profound. When we're able to nurture hope, we see better reactions and compliance to treatment initiatives. And actual research suggesting, improved survival rates when we're able to nurture that hope.
So there is an association between what you've seen as increased survival rates and hope levels increasing, which that's mind blowing. When I've talked about these types of things in groups, there are always people who put up their hand and they go, I can attest to that personally with somebody I know.
It really is. And as you said, it's such an experience that touches all of us. I certainly, in watching my father-in-law sort of navigate through his cancer to, an initial experience of despair and angst. But when I saw that his hope, his ability to now navigate through pathways, things that he had control over, I literally watched his well-being, his energy level, his quality of life significantly improved. And what I saw was him become a partner in his health care team in fighting the cancer.
We all deal with different types of pain, whether it's the emotional pain, like dealing with stress, breakups, or loneliness, or physical pain, like pushing through tough training or recovering from an injury. But if we boost our hope levels, can it actually change the way we experience pain?
The founder of hope theory, Rick Snyder, in some very specific experimental designs, demonstrated that when hope was higher, pain tolerance was significantly higher. And this is going to be critical in terms of recovery from things like surgery because of the ability to be mobile, to move around, to endure. It doesn't make the pain disappear, but the tolerance of that pain can improve, which will aid in recovery. I think it's also important to start thinking about this even in the context of, immune deficiencies and autoimmune kinds of diseases like fibromyalgia, where pain is sometimes debilitating.
Okay, I'm going to ask about stress next, because I think we can all agree that's something we're all dealing with right now. Chan actually led a groundbreaking study on stress, specifically looking at children who are at risk of abuse or neglect. The findings were pretty extraordinary.
Parenting is an exercise in hope, right? Parenting is hard and by default will be very stressful. One of the things that we know is one of the strongest predictors of child maltreatment is parenting stress. And what our research shows is that when we nurture hope, parenting stress decreases and parent-child relationship actually improves. Parents by and large don't wake up in the morning thinking they're going to be negligent to their children. It's that they're experiencing profound stress and chaos in their lives. And when you and I are at that space of chaos and stress, the ability to regulate our thoughts, emotions, and behaviors becomes a little distorted. And so we can sometimes do things, explode or act out in ways that we normally wouldn't. And so what we've found is that working with parents who they've been identified by the system as being at high risk for child maltreatment due to environmental constraints, poverty, for instance. But when we nurture hope in the parents, their parenting stress levels significantly decrease.
And that ultimately protects the children.
And that protects the children and the family in the greater picture. Yes.
What Chan is saying here is kind of a revelation. It's not just about love or intention. Chan is saying that they found that the root problem of a lot of issues in families is the parent's own individual stress level, especially from things like financial issues or domestic struggles. Now, here's the kicker. When you introduce hope, it makes people better able to manage that stress. And when the stress goes down, the ability to handle those tough, chaotic moments goes up. And that ultimately helps protect the children from harm. Hope isn't some fluffy idea. It's a game changer when it comes to stress management.
On that note, is that related to the idea of cognitive resources being limited? In the same way, if I have an extra long day at work, I am so much likelier to snap at a loved one that night. And I just used up more cognitive resources in the day than I usually do, so I had fewer at night to self-regulate.
Research shows that our willpower is a limited resource. And throughout the day, we are depleting that resource of energy. We've all gone home at the end of the day mentally exhausted or emotionally exhausted. That willpower has been depleted. And because of that, it makes it much more difficult for us to control our behaviors, our emotions. We're dysregulated.
I think so many people can relate to the fact that, if you snap at somebody, you, hate yourself. And of course, we want to hold ourselves accountable. But at the same time, it makes sense that if you're having trouble controlling your emotions or feeling put together, that it could be related to how much we are taxing ourselves throughout the day.
You're absolutely right. We exist in these environments that are high stress, and so it's demanding so much focus. We've actually published probably 4 studies now looking at the practice of mindfulness as a pathway to protect our hope. And so when you and I are experiencing the chaos of a day or a situation that we're in or an environment that we're in, when we're in that chaos, it becomes very difficult to focus on those pathways, on how to get there from here. And what our research has shown in very high stress environments, incarcerated women, for instance, is that mindfulness can become a pathway to help settle the willpower so we can focus on those pathway pursuits to help us manage that daily stress. By the way, we've also done those studies with yoga, and contemplative prayer have similar effects.
So this association between mindfulness and hope, what would it look like for somebody to increase their hope level via mindfulness?
We think about even in the school systems where, there are some schools where we start the classroom day maybe in homeroom where we just settle and breathe and go through those exercises of becoming present so that we can focus on the task at hand. Some of the studies that I've been involved in or led that we've published on is looking at, for instance, mindfulness as a protective factor that nurtures hope among caregivers in areas of dementia, which is a daily stress. But what we found is that by going through a mindfulness-based stress reduction, for instance, we found over time significant reductions in stress and significant improvements in hope, which again is going to have a significant impact on caregiver burden and stress. One of my colleagues at the university, he's an occupational therapist professor, and he trains on hope. And in his classrooms at the university, graduate classrooms, he starts every class with mindfulness practice before they begin, how they're going to treat and work with patients who may cause them a lot of stress as a healthcare provider. How do they navigate through, their own difficult situations and stay present? One of the things that I found as very interesting is even the practice of mindfulness in terms of self-compassion has such a profound impact on hope, but also in terms of well-being. And so we've published on some of those practices as well. I ended up being a big fan of mindfulness practice because the data is just so clear. And to be able to have that tool to nurture hope it's a gift.
Chan actually points out that the emotion of rage is extremely tied to hope. It's actually the first step in realizing the pathway to your goal is blocked. So if you are feeling rage, it's actually often an indicator that you're still engaged in hope.
In all honesty, what we see in the loss of hope is this sort of staircase of anger, frustration, anxiety. And, when our pathways are experiencing barriers, those are pretty natural reactions. And so I think, that as we experience those kinds of things, to recognize that we do experience those emotions naturally and normally, and to give yourself some grace and forgiveness in the fact that when we're angry and frustrated, we may say and think and do things that we wouldn't normally do.
What's even more fascinating is that neuroscience has now begun to uncover the physical structures in our brain connected to hope. It's rooted in our biology.
Hope, it's part of that prefrontal cortex of the brain. But to begin to isolate the very specific areas, one of the things that we're looking at, for instance, is how does childhood trauma influence brain development? And not just the stuff that we're looking at, but other researchers in the brain sciences are starting to find where hope biologically is a buffer to anxiety and stress.
So hope it can actually be a protective force.
Very much so. Very much so. Physically, but also emotionally and psychologically.
So we've talked about how hope works in theory, but how do we actually apply it when we're facing obstacles? This is where the GAP framework comes in: goals, agency, or pathways.
Oftentimes when we experience big life stresses and problems, it feels so overwhelming that we just don't even know where to start or what it is that we can do. And I personally believe, and the research supports it, that hope can be this framework where I can look at this complex problem and say, is this a goal problem? Is this a pathways problem? Or is this a willpower problem? And then once I identify that, then I can begin to focus in my energy on which of those. So for instance, if you know that you want to achieve some goal, but how to get there is something that you struggle with, it's very reasonable to think, okay, well, let's identify other people who have achieved that goal. And let's go learn and inquire, how did they get there from here? So we can begin to look for hope models in our life.
So that would be an example of a situation where you have a deficit in the pathway, right? So you would reach out to a network and figure out what others have done in order to fill that deficit.
Absolutely. That's exactly what I would recommend to people.
I think a lot of times, anytime we're experiencing a problem, we go to goals and we're like, okay, how do we change the goals in this? But sometimes that's not the issue, right?
Sure. Yeah. It's not necessarily the power of solving the problem, of going from, low hope to high hope, because what we see is when we just move the needle on hope, maybe increase it by a couple of points. Our published research shows that just moving the needle will produce profound outcomes in well-being.
So kind of getting at this idea that hope isn't a binary, like you're not hopeful or you're hopeful and you belong in one category, which I honestly think we often think of it that way. Hope is really like a range, and any movement within that range gives you almost like disproportionately large improvements in your life.
That's absolutely right. I think we sometimes think about things like hope and resilience as these, you either have it or you don't have it. And we know that hope ebbs and flows in our lives. And I think it's really helpful for individuals to recognize that just beginning the journey and taking the first couple of steps towards your goal is going to have such profound outcomes emotionally, cognitively, relationally.
So in some ways, if you're waking up feeling really low in hope every day, it's not a matter of becoming the most hopeful person you know. It's just a matter of increasing it a little bit through goals, agency, and pathways, realizing which is missing in my life.
That's exactly right. So, you don't have to focus on summiting the mountain. You just have to get to this first switchback. You have to just begin the journey, and then, willpower and pathways thinking improve.
This makes me think about what happens when it feels like the world won't let us feel hope. When we face circumstances beyond our control, making hope seem impossible to grasp. I've sure had moments like this, especially lately.
I want to switch to talking about control for a second. In circumstances where our control feels very limited, and I think a lot of people can relate to feeling this right now, whether it's about things happening in the world, about climate change, about adversity we face. What options are there for people when their control is limited to maintain hope?
So this is a really complex question, and I actually have a recent experience that I think can kind of highlight or at least connect with this idea of limited control. And in several different states, I'm working with agencies that work with juvenile affairs, juvenile rehabilitation. I was touring the treatment facility here in Oklahoma, where I'm from. And it's an agency that has become hope-centered. It's been an amazing journey. And so I was fortunate enough to get a tour of the treatment center, and in particular, a small group of young men were giving me this tour. So they were showing me the education center, the dorms, the gym, the canteen. And as we're walking between buildings, this young man is with me, and he begins to share with me that pretty soon he's going to go back in front of the judge who's going to review his case. And this young man shares with me that if he's not successful, the judge will actually transition him into the adult system, and he'll start with 18 years. And so as that young man shared that, I was just, the profound sort of lack of control, right, in that moment. But he said something that really tore at my heart. And he said, I'm going to lose my youth. And it was in that moment that I started to think that if that young man sees his future as being dictated to him, that is outside of his control, that is, he sees his future as being in prison, then why in the world would he engage in any of the pathways or the programs that are available to him in the juvenile affairs facility? And so it really sort of began to strike me that the way that we see our future, what's possible, is a real driver of the pathways that we will engage in. And so For me, it becomes the key. We've done some research with our Department of Corrections where we're looking at hope in particular with incarcerated women. And what we're finding is that engagement in social connectedness within prison, engagement in workforce development program services are actually nurturing hope. And we're seeing improvements in incarcerated women's well-being.
Few people have less control over their environment than individuals who are in prison, right? Somebody who doesn't have a choice over where they live, when they go outside, what they eat, like every aspect of their lives. And you're getting at this idea that they're still able to cultivate hope and agency and willpower in some way that actually changes their outcome and well-being.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. We do pay attention to these environmental constraints. And when I say constraints, it constrains the pathways that I have access to. And as you said, where so much of daily life becomes dictated. And so part of nurturing hope in those spaces is to recognize that within the context of those constraints, what are some goals that you desire? Increasingly, we're seeing college programs in prisons where, quite frankly, as individuals identify goals, begin to engage in those pathways, their flourishing actually improves dramatically, even in individuals with long-term prison sentences. The research is pretty clear that hope has this profound predictive ability, but more importantly, it's simplicity. It's the simplicity of hope, goals, pathways, and willpower that allow us to now take action.
We know that setting goals that are both doable and desirable is key. But what about those big moonshot goals? The ones that seem almost out of reach? Do they have a place in hope too?
So on that note, like if hope is one of the most effective things we can do to increase performance, for example, like the athletes, when it comes to goal setting, we often think, okay, we need to set really doable, feasible goals, but sometimes you kind of set a moonshot goal. I've set a few of these in my life. I've also worked for organizations that set these moonshot goals of like trying to achieve things that are seemingly impossible. We might not have the technology or the policy framework for it yet. Moonshot goals versus feasible goals. What's the difference and how does hope interplay with those?
Sure. So a moonshot goal is a very aspirational goal. So these aspirational goals tend to be more likely stretch goals, goals that are going to stretch us beyond our current status, our current skill set. Maybe we have to develop new relationships. And so we also know then things like what are our support structures and what are the potential detractors from these moonshot goals and how are we going to begin to handle those? So I'm kind of infusing how do we do hope in the context of the moonshot goal. But if we have, for instance, a high hope individual, somebody who really has strong willpower, has this problem solving capacity, what the goal setting research has helped us understand is that when we set easily attainable goals, higher hope individuals will get bored with that. And so they'll tend to find ways to add some adversity or to make it more challenging in some fashion.
It's true. Some people don't just chase goals. They quietly make things harder for themselves. Like, they'll intentionally limit their own resources. Ever heard of an unassisted Antarctic expedition? And then there's the time cutters, like the founder who's going to launch next year. Next thing you know, they pushed the date up 6 months, skipped the soft launch, and went live on a random Tuesday. High hope people don't just achieve goals. Whether or not they're aware of it, they insist on growing through the pursuit. And they don't wait for that growth to happen. They force it.
So the research also shows that when we set those high rates of expectations, performance tends to increase. So even though there's a higher likelihood of potential failure, the aspiration of that creates a motivational movement, so to speak.
Which is kind of the power of these moonshot goals, is it can lead to kind of this collective movement. And it's interesting. I'm hearing two things you're saying. One is that if you set goals that are higher than you would have otherwise, you are likelier to end up in a better place, even if you don't achieve that goal. Shoot for the moon. Even if you miss, you'll land among the stars kind of mindset. And then the second thing I'm hearing, which is so fascinating, is if you increase your hope level, you have more access to moonshot or stretch goals, that you are likelier to set them and pursue them and therefore get better results. So you can dream bigger if you increase your hope level.
Right. Right. So what we know in our work, for instance, let's say that I work with a middle school aged youth and they want to be an NBA basketball star. It may be in those scenarios that we're more likely to think about how do we get that youth to think about other career alternatives. But in this context of hope, I'm going to lean right into that aspiration, because in all honesty, some people are NBA basketball stars. So it is possible, right? So as I'm working with this youth, I'm going to say, okay, in order to be an NBA basketball star, what has to happen? And so what I want is for that youth to start telling me about the draft and what it's going to look like and feel like when his name is called and the jersey's up and people are loving and adoring. So now I'm working on that idea of imagination as the instrument of hope, that ability to see myself in the future. So as we take steps back, in order to be drafted, what has to happen? Well, everybody has to know who I am. Well, in order for everybody to know who you are, what has to happen? Well, I have to be on a team. In order to be on a team, what has to happen? So what I do is I break it down into those benchmarks or sub goals. And ultimately, that youth is going to identify being in school as a pathway to their goal. But and I'm going back to what you highlighted, is let's say that they get one or two steps successful. They are in a completely different place to imagine the future than they were 2 steps ago. And that's all I'm working towards, is what are the strengths that are coming along with that? What we know is that nurturing hope will improve educational outcomes. Well, a youth going from a D average in the classroom to a C average, that's a game changer for that youth. That's going to be my focus.
Pathways, right? Helping them identify those pathways. If that youth says, I want to be a competent basketball player, that's my goal, I can imagine he would end up in a very different place as him saying, I want to join the NBA, even if he doesn't reach that goal. Mm-hmm. Like, he's going to be a way better basketball player because of that way higher moonshot aspirational goal.
Yeah. I mean, engagement in practice and in trying and in learning, controlling the body in the way that you do certain things. Imagine the discovery.
So it's not about our goal realization rate, how often we reach the goal. It's a matter of where we place them and the progress we make along the way.
Yeah, so it certainly has a higher likelihood of failure. But for me, what you're really highlighting, which is important in hope, for me, thinking about the capacity to flourish is really about finding meaning and purpose in the journey of, I've had these failures, but what did they teach me and how did they propel me to be right here today? And so I think about, for instance, even my own adversity and my own personal experience in my childhood. I wouldn't wish that on anybody. And, I wish I had never experienced that. But all of those experiences are why I'm sitting here today talking to you. And so, so much meaning and purpose and the suffering that I've learned.
You've helped advance this field so much and brought it to the public, which is, I think, one of the greatest gifts of your work. And at the same time, you have a story of hope in your own life. What was that journey like to realize that it wasn't just your work, but it was also your story that was part of the hope work you do?
Right. So I think this will be a big part of the next book, which is, I want to finish that story because I think about the fact that I did go to college. I was ultimately successful. I went to grad school. I pursued and attained a PhD. Interestingly enough, my PhD is in psychology, but I avoided counseling and clinical psychology and gravitated towards research and statistics. It's interesting that I worked with organizations in domestic violence and child maltreatment and homelessness, because what I realized is that I was always there, right? Even in my own professional journey. And I was always on the, periphery of those spaces that I experienced as a child, and finally putting those two together, that it was almost like a calling that I needed to have these experiences personally to grow professionally, and then ultimately bring them together. And I am sometimes reluctant to talk about my own personal story, but I think that it helps people understand that hope is such a real thing.
There's so many things I'm thinking about, because on some level, I believe this, on some level, we often become the person we needed in our younger years, right? And I now speak on hope, and like that was what I needed when I was younger. I needed hope. I was deeply hopeless. And I remember at one event I did at UCLA with students, one student came up to me and she just said, this story makes me emotional, because it was so powerful to look at her eyes and for her to just say, I can't do this anymore. Mm. And she was like, how did you go? Because I shared that I thought there's no way I was going to live a long life in my teenagers. Like the idea of getting to next week was hard, let alone like 70, 80. And she just said, how can you go from that to being in another place? And I told her about Dr. Chan Hellman. And I said, his story is going from somebody who had planned to no longer be here to being the foremost hope researcher in the world. The reaction she had to just know you could go from a place of pain and then help advance a field about humanity that was going to impact so many people. Like, I've never seen someone react like that. And she left feeling differently and thinking differently about herself, which is the power of our stories, I think. So the fact that you've been willing to not only contribute to this field, but share your story alongside it, I think is deeply empowering for people and a huge contribution.
Wow, that's very kind. Thank you so much for that. That's, in my opinion, the capacity for hope is a basic human right. And we need to find strategies to be intentional about nurturing hope, especially among children and families experiencing tremendous adversity. One of the things that I often hear about hope is that, people will refer to hope as light at the end of the tunnel. But I think more about hope, not as light at the end of the tunnel, but more about light in the tunnel. Because for me, light at the end of the tunnel means I'm approaching the end of the adversity or the fear and uncertainty. And I appreciate having it at the end. I need it in the middle. I need hope in the tunnel. And that hope is the source of endurance, of tremendous pain and suffering and struggle. And so that really is my passion, is how do we find simple strategies that are accessible to everybody, not just people with degrees and certifications, and but how do we make hope accessible, because it is such a powerful predictor of well-being. That's my passion, is I want to find strategies that we can be more intentional.
My goal with this podcast is simple: to take big ideas and make them practical for you. You just heard from today's guest, and now it's time to break down those insights into actionable tools you can use in your own life. For today's how-to, I'm going to start by telling you a story. The story starts with the fact that I'm a pretty mediocre ice climber. I remember in my first year of ice climbing, and I was staring out across the canyon to the other wall, and I asked my climbing partner, "What's that?" And I was pointing to these just magnificent frozen waterfalls. And he said, "Oh, that's one of the most aesthetic routes in the canyon." So to give you some background on ice climbing for this story, some routes are multi-pitch. And so that means they're multiple rope lengths high. You climb much longer routes by going up partway, building an anchor, your partner comes up there. So you're both partway up the route. And then you go from that anchor higher, build a new anchor, your partner comes up. So when you hear people climb these big alpine ice routes. Say they're climbing 1,000 feet of ice. They don't have 1,000-foot long rope, right? They have a 60, 70 meter rope typically, and they're just climbing a part way as they go. So this route is 3 pitches. And so you build 2 anchors on the way. It's graded WI5, which is just a harder grade than the more moderate routes I'd been hanging out on. And in ice climbing, leading is considered harder than following because when you lead, you're the first person that goes up and you put in ice screws into the ice as you go. So if you fall, you would conceivably fall onto your last ice screw, which means you could take a sizable fall. And the rule in ice climbing is to not fall. Like rock climbing is a little bit more flexible with falling, but in ice, ideally you like never fall. So early in the season, I was following this route with a friend who was leading it. So doing the hard stuff. And in the back of my mind, I had this barely perceptible thought of, I wonder if I could lead this route by the end of the season. But it was one of those goals that seemed far beyond my abilities. I felt almost embarrassed to even consider it. Like, oh, yeah, I think I could maybe lead a route that's WI5. So I didn't even admit this goal out loud to myself, let alone to anyone else. And to be honest, I realize I do this. I don't admit goals out loud, even to myself. And the reason is because it's not because I'm afraid to fail, like whatever, I'm used to that. It's really that I don't want to face the fact that I'm not trying, that I didn't try, that I didn't show up. Like, I don't want to face that part of myself. This is a really lame way to live. Like, I realize this is a super dumb thing I do. So anyway, as the season progressed, I managed to lead the first and third pitch, the beginning and the end. But the second pitch, which is the hard pitch, that I hadn't led. And that's actually what's graded WI5. And at this point, I just feel the, desire to throw in the towel. I'm just kind of like, whatever, I didn't even really want to do this anyway. And I had a friend and he could see it. To be honest, this is one of those goals for me that felt out of reach completely and then somewhat feasible. And so we head out, and this is one of the last days that you can climb in this canyon for the season. And to be honest, I had this plan to just bail. Like, I'd climb the first pitch and then be like, oh, I'm tired. And then like go home and eat pizza and whatever. I didn't admit the goal out loud to myself, so I don't have to face the fact that I didn't actually try. That kind of thing. So anyway, we went out and I climbed the first pitch and I'm looking out at the bottom of the second. And so here's a photo. I'm looking up. You can see how intimidated I am. And you can see the route felt very steep at the bottom for me. And I'm looking up at it and he's like, do what you set out to do, Molly. So I go, okay. But as I start climbing, and this is actually funny, I didn't want to be scared. So I told him just to talk to me. And I'm just talking on the way up. Actually, this is funny. I'm just talking about like hope research and like, oh, they found this about hope in students. It leads to these better academic outcomes. And he cannot hear what I'm saying because I'm climbing up. But he can hear when I like finish talking and he knows it's like a moment. So he goes,
wow.
That's a very supportive friend. But to be honest, what happened was I went into this kind of meditative state while talking about hope. I climbed the best I've ever climbed. Like I wasn't scared at any point. I wasn't anxious. I didn't get tired. My arms didn't get pumped. I just kept climbing. And once I got to the top, I remember I was building an anchor and I realized like, wow, like how did I end up here? I kind of blacked out. He came up.
Oh, nice lead.
And then I climbed the third pitch and we topped out and it was the best I've ever climbed. I was so excited and proud of myself. But the kicker in this, I look back on, say I had this goal, right? I wonder if I could lead this by the end of the season. And say we come to the end of the season and I can't. The thing that I realized is that I was a way better ice climber regardless for having aimed so much higher. And that brings me to today's how-to. Stretch goals, moonshots, big swings, whatever we want to call them, can be amazing, but they can also be risky. We know that high hope people tend to set higher goals, even though their likelihood of failure is much higher. Why? Because if they miss, they likelier still land somewhere better than if they play it safe. That's what happened to me on this route. Regardless of whether or not I had achieved that goal, I was a better ice climber at the end of the day than I would have been. And if you care about performance, this is relevant. So the rule of thumb around stretch goals can be this. You can stretch the goal when you have 2 things. 1, strong support, and 2, clear pathways. Those are the green lights. That's when you go. Okay, let's break this down. The two things I mentioned, support and clear pathways. 1, support means the people around you, friends, mentors, your partner, colleagues, anybody who is there who can encourage you, support you, but also hold you accountable or call you out for not going after your dreams. That kind of support is really important. So my friend who I had climbed with that day, my friend Ethan, I had deliberately chosen him as my climbing partner that day because I knew he was the right type of social support I needed to go, that he was actually going to encourage me, but also kind of hold me accountable, right? He was like, do what you set out to do. Whew, that's like a tough thing to hear. They're reminding you of your initiative, and that's important. And 2, the pathway is just having a clear plan, right? Having a route to get there. For me, it was following that route a little bit and just training on steeper ice. And I think this is important too. You don't necessarily have to believe you can do something. Like, to be totally frank with you, it wasn't like deep down I believed I could do it and I did it. It really wasn't that. Staring up at that route from the bottom, I had questioned whether or not I should go up. And I think sometimes the goal isn't there necessarily to be met. It's there to pull you forward. The goal is just the conduit. It's the excuse to help you up your performance or become better or whatever it is you're trying to do. God, that sounds so dumb when I say it out loud because it's like, duh. But it's like, this is part of the lens of hope. Success isn't about your goal hitting rate, right? Nobody really actually cares what goal you set for yourself and whether or not you met it. They don't care. It's just about what happens to you in the process of aiming for it. And this idea that however high you aim is your ceiling, so you might as well aim higher when the conditions are right. And anybody who has ever gone in and asked for a raise knows this. We can only go as high as we shoot. This is like hard for me to even admit out loud to myself, right? Because I don't follow a lot of this advice. I'm learning. And I think if we're only setting goals that we're sure we can hit, we might be aiming too low. And that version of us might be missing out on the version of who we could become. So the next time you're feeling high in hope and you're feeling ambitious and you're like, can I aim higher? Ask yourself, do I have clear social support? And do I have at least one clear pathway? If yes, take the swing. Stretch a little higher than feels comfortable. You might as well, because you'll reap the benefits regardless of what happens with the goal. I put together a newsletter with all the stuff I've had to learn the hard way and all the strategies I use in my own life. It's called What I Wish I Knew. It'll also include all the how-tos we break down here on the podcast. I also share behind-the-scenes moments, visuals, and photos from the stories, and whatever else is on my mind. Sign up at mollykawahata.com/join, JOIN. Try it out. You can unsubscribe anytime. And if this episode made you think of someone, send it their way. Some of the most helpful podcasts I've ever heard came from a friend who recommended an episode. And finally, I've got one ask for you. Hit the follow button and leave us a 5-star review. It helps us grow the show and bring on more of the guests you'll want to hear from. All right, there's more to come. I'll see you in the next episode.